Good morning, Mr. Kinard.
Hi, Susan. Glad to see you.
Good to see you too, Mr. Kinard. I first want to start off by thanking you for your time today to interview with me. But most importantly, I am so grateful to you for your service in the Korean War. You know, my mom was just a little girl. My dad also fought in the war. But I know without America's help and without American heroes like you, I wouldn't be sitting here across from you today to do this interview. I am so grateful to you and all of our Korean War veterans who have suffered so much and endured so much and sacrificed so much to save us and give us our freedoms. And I can never thank you enough. I can never thank our veterans enough. But I hope in recording your stories that I can help honor you and our veterans and preserve the legacy of our Korean War veterans. And it is such an honor, Mr. Kinard, to speak with you today, knowing of your story and knowing of how involved you have been throughout your life with Korean War veterans. So I just thank you so much for your service, Mr. Kinard.
Thank you, Susan. It's something that I feel very deeply about all of my life. One of the things that I wanted to do is to make sure people know and understand what the Korean War was all about. In my view, and I will say it right here up front, people think of it as the forgotten war. And I guess in a way it is because it happened right after World War II and Vietnam. People tend to skip over what we did in the Korean War. But if you look at it in reality and the fact that we saved the country and saved its people, that's more like a forgotten victory than a forgotten war.
That is so true, Mr. Kinard. Very well said. And the fact that South Korea was not lost to communists is a huge victory.
Absolutely.
You know, I thank God every day that I am not in North Korea. And I think that's how people need to understand what we have been saved from. Not only that the freedoms were given to us, but also we have been saved from that kind of imprisonment under that kind of tyranny. And so it is absolutely a victory, as you said, Mr. Kinard. I absolutely agree with you. So to get started with our interview, we're going to do it in 3 segments today. So we're going to start off first talking about what you were doing before the war, a little bit about your life before the war, then what happened during the war, and what duties you had and some of the experiences you remember from Korea, and then all the activities, the many things that I know you have accomplished even after the war related to the Korean War veterans. So that's how we're going to progress. So the first question I'm going to ask you, Mr. Kinard, is can you tell me a little bit about your family and where you grew up?
Yes, I'll be glad to do that. I grew up in West Texas. And when you think about where I've lived the last many years of my life, that was the beginning. I was born in Cisco, Texas, which is in central Texas, on August 13th, 1928. And we moved several times. My father worked for an oil company, and they're notorious for having the families move around. So being born in Cisco, then we moved to a small town in West Texas named McCamey, and that's where I started school. From there, we moved to Wink, which was another small oil town, and from there to Odessa, where I graduated in 1945 as valedictorian of our high school class. I was very proud of that. So my mother and father, I have a sister that is just younger than I, and we, of course, grew up together, but I left home when I was just 16 to go to Texas A&M. My mother and father helped me, of course, and I worked in the oil fields during the summertime to earn enough money to stay in college. So I went to A&M, which was a military. At the time I went to school, you had to join the ROTC. It was a military school. And I had taken 3 years of ROTC, very basic in high school, and liked it. So I decided to go to a military school, and A&M was the one that I knew about and had loved hearing about all of my life. So I joined the ROTC at Texas A&M, studied mechanical engineering, and also had 4 years of ROTC training. One of those years, my junior year, I went to Fort Sill. They had that as part of the curriculum that you'd go 6 weeks of basic training at a military base. So that's what we did in Fort Sill. And we learned the basics there of what artillery is all about if you signed up for the artillery, and that's the one I wanted to be in. So we studied in Fort Sill to be a forward observer in the 6 weeks I was there. Then I finally graduated in the summer of 1949 and went to work for a power company out in West Texas. And just as kind of a training engineer, and learned a lot about the power business, which I liked because it was just down the lines of what I'd studied as a mechanical engineer. I was single at the time, living in a bunkhouse in Monahans, Texas. Worked at the power plant and lived in a bunkhouse by the power plant. And one morning in, I guess it was August of 1950, I heard that the Korean War had started. And I didn't know whether I would actually go or not because I was not in the active reserve. I knew I was reserved, signed, attached to a reserve unit in Midland. And sure enough, after about 2 or 3 weeks after the war started, I got a telephone call that said, "You're now in the Army. Even though you were in the inactive reserves, we're calling all of the officers in this Midland, Texas reserve unit. And we're sending you to Camp Chaffee, Arkansas to start training replacements for Korea." So that was where I actually started and how I got into the Army at that time.
Okay. Well, Mr. Kinard, I forgot that we have some pictures to show everyone of how you looked when you were a cadet at Texas A&M and as a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army. So let's go ahead and do that right now. I'm going to show everyone some pictures.
Okay.
Okay, so this is a picture of you, Mr. Kinard, at Texas A&M. And what grade level were you here? Were you a senior in this picture?
No, that was a senior picture.
I'm sorry, can you repeat what you just said?
Yeah, I was a senior at the time that picture was made.
Yes.
I was company commander of one of we had 2 companies in the band at that time. One was called a Maroon Band, the other was White Band, and we performed a lot at the football games. And at that time, I was company commander of the White Band.
I'm so sorry, Mr. Kinard. My printer is going crazy here. I don't know if we need to repeat that. I just turned off my printer. I'm so sorry. I turned off my phone, but I didn't think to turn off my printer, so it was going crazy here behind me. Can you please explain again that you were part of the Corps Cadets and your involvement in the band?
Yes, I was the company commander. I was a captain in the Cadet Corps at the time, and I was commander of the White Band. We had about 200 members in the White Band, the same in the Maroon Band. So when we marched on the field, we had somewhere around 350 to 400 members marching. We were famous for being able to do some of the formations that we did, and very proud of the fact that I was in the Texas Aggie Band and we did so well.
Yes, I've seen how they march today. They're really impressive. And I hope you had fun while you were doing it. It must have been a lot of work, but I hope you enjoyed it.
Oh, we did a lot of work. It sometimes created a little crush with my engineering studies because that was very hard, but we did a lot of practice.
I see.
We had a field behind the dormitory where we lived, and we would practice almost every day after classes on doing the formations that we would do on the weekend.
Now, I didn't ask you earlier when you were talking about your interest in ROTC, even in high school, and then going into the Corps of Cadets in college. I didn't ask you, what made you interested in the military? Do you have somebody in your family that was in the military? What got you interested in serving in the military?
Well, at the time, the World War II was going on. So I felt like there may be a good possibility that I would have to go serve. But when I graduated from Odessa High, I was just 16, and I was in the ROTC program in Odessa, Texas at the time, and I enjoyed studying about the military and being part of it. And early in my life, I had met a young man who worked for the same company my father did, was a graduate of Texas A&M, and he told me all about A&M and how good the school was and what they did in the military, and that just appealed to me.
I see.
And the fact that we were still in a war, I wanted to be prepared to serve if I had to go.
That's really admirable, and how inspirational it must have been for you to meet your father's friend who had gone to Texas A&M. So
Yes,
this was in this picture was from
45 when I
1945.
graduated.
Wow. World
Yeah.
War II era. Yes. The next picture we have here. Okay. I don't know why it's not advancing. Let me see what's going on. I hope it's not stuck. Oops. I think, okay, there we go. Okay. This is a picture of you as a commissioned officer with the U.S. Army. You served with the 39th Field Artillery Battalion, 15th Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, attached to I Company. You were in Korea from January 52 to September 1952. Your duties were as an artillery forward observer, and the area that you served in was in the front lines of battle at Chorwon Valley, and also in the Imjin River area, including Kelly Hill, Big and Little Nori, and Sugarloaf. So we'll talk a little bit more in detail about the various things that happened while you were there in Korea. But this is a picture of you as a young officer, just newly commissioned after graduating from Texas A&M.
Well, let's talk a little bit about prior to going to Korea. When our reserve unit was activated in August of 1950, we went to Camp Chaffee. We were the first group there trying to set up a training system for replacements to go to Korea. So during that time, I actually served at Camp Chaffee from September of 1950 to first part of 52. And what we were doing at that time is primarily trying to support the Army in Korea. At the time, we had a lot of losses early in the war, so our job was to try to train as quickly as we could replacements to go to Korea. When I went in September of 1950, I was there as part of what they call a training cadre to supply replacements to Korea. And I might add that I got married in December before I went back to Camp Chaffee, got married then, and we had a little girl in November of 1951. When I went to Korea, I had a wife and small child at the time, and my wife went with me from Camp Chaffee to San Francisco, where I left on a plane to go to Korea. So that happened in January of 1952.
I see. So I didn't know that you had already married and had a little girl a baby
Well,
girl before you went to Korea. That must have been very difficult for Mrs. Kinard to be sending her husband to a war.
yeah, that's one of the sad parts of having to go to Korea like it was, because she was able to go back home and live with her parents while I was gone.
Mhm.
And, you know, the strange part about all of that, we met a lot of people in this small town of Monahans where we were living at the time. And a lot of people didn't know where Korea was or where I was going. And Betty quickly told them that there was a big war going on over there, and that's what I was going to be doing.
Mhm.
So we got a lot of family support at that time. And my mother and father still lived in Odessa or out north of Odessa. So they were all very carefully watching all the news that they could get from Korea to find out where I was and what I was doing.
Mhm. So, so then now you're headed off to Korea. How did you get to Korea? By ship or did you fly?
No, my orders had said, we are very short on forward observers and you need to get here as quickly as you can. So we had a departure date out of San Francisco at that time. So we drove, Betty went with me. We went directly by car to uh, San Francisco. Camp Travis is what it was. And they put us on a plane. We flew on a military air transport, which was very primitive. The plane was used to bring wounded from Korea back to the United States. So all we had was we had box lunches to eat and canvas seating on the side and canvas cots in the middle that we could sleep. And we had 3 stops from San Francisco. The first stop was Hawaii. We landed at Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii and spent 3 days there because one of the engines had been leaking oil. So they had to repair the engine on the plane before we could make the next step. Then we flew to Wake Island. And from Wake Island, we flew then to Haneda Air Force Base in Japan. Now, it was supposed to take 36 hours to do that, 12 hours on each leg of the way, but with that layover in Hawaii had, which was kind of nice, by the way. I never had been to Hawaii and haven't since, but we had a good 3 days visit in Hawaii and then finally got to Japan where they put us in a school for 2 weeks for uh, CPR training. They were concerned at the time that we might be involved in chemical warfare or atomic warfare. So they wanted all the officers that were coming through there to be refreshed on all of the things you needed to know about the CBR problems.
And what does CBR stand for, Mr. Kinard?
Chemical, biological, and radiological warfare.
I see. I see. There was a lot of propaganda from North Korea about that, wasn't there, during the
Yeah,
war? Yeah.
yeah. Well, they were very concerned that someone might get desperate enough that they were going to use one of those bad weapons. So they wanted us to be prepared and
Mhm.
gave us equipment to be able to resist it. And I was glad we were going to be able to do that.
That's good. So after your CBR training or course, how did you get from Anita to Korea? Did you take a ship from Japan?
We were actually in Gifu. We'd left Haneda by train and went to a small town in Japan named Gifu, and the training was done at what they call the West Point of the Air. That's where the Japanese pilots, it was a wonderful place. And so we took the train and traveled from Gifu to Port Sasebo, which was on the kind of northwestern part of Japan. And we were on a ship from Port Sasebo to Busan, kind of an overnight journey from there to Busan.
Mhm.
There we were unloaded and put on another train to travel north to Taegu, is where we would get our assignment. At that place, I was given assignment to the 3rd Infantry Division.
Okay. So you were so you went from Busan to Daegu by train, and then where did you go from there? And how did you get to the front lines?
Well, we went to Taegu
Mhm.
and stayed a couple of days where they gave us our assignment. And I was assigned to the 3rd Infantry Division. Then we got back on that same train and went to Seoul, where the 3rd Infantry Replacement Center was. So I stayed there a couple of days so they could assign me to an actual battery. So I think I was there about 2 days, and then a Jeep came down from the front lines where the howitzers were and took me up to our battery, which was C Battery of the 39th Field Artillery Battalion. And at that place, we were at Uijeonbu. The town was a little bit behind the MLR because the 3rd Division was in reserve at the time, but they had our battalion supporting the 1st Rock Division. When we went to the line, I was assigned to a Rock Division as a part observer, the 1st Rock Division.
And for people in the audience who doesn't know what ROK stands for, that's the Republic of Korea. So that's the South Korean Army, first division that you're assigned to because they didn't have anyone to do the duty that they were looking to fill, which is as an artillery forward observer. So let's go into that, Mr. Kinard. Can you describe for the audience here, what exactly does an artillery forward observer do? And if you can kind of describe your duties.
Yes. Well, as most people probably know, artillery is in support of the infantry troops who are on the front line. So when you need to have artillery directed to the enemy, they do it through the forward observer. So our job was to man an OP, an observation post, and look through. We had what they called a BC scope, or a high-powered telescope, to look out in the enemy territory and watch for movement, any movement that you could see that was worth expending artillery on. And our job was to work very closely with the company commander of the infantry company to supply support for them and try to bring artillery or whatever we had at our disposal against the enemy to help protect the infantry.
Now, I think in our earlier phone conversation, Mr. Kinard, you described where you were actually situated. You were in kind of a bunker, is that correct? With
Right.
a small slit where you could look through that slit with a telescope.
That's right.
And I think we also talked about the fact that you would call for fire even at night. And how would you actually see clearly at night to, call in target positions for artillery? Could you describe how you would do this duty at night when you
Yes, most of the assaults that were made on the infantry who were in the trenches, and you can imagine trenches very much like they had in World War I. So all of the infantry was lined up along a trench line. And when we'd have an assault or when we needed to do something at night in particular, we had shells that you could fire and had a little parachute on it with a flare. And that would give you light, sufficient light to see what was going on out in front of you. During the daytime, we wouldn't have much of a problem of seeing, but at night when you had an assault, and we had several of those assaults on our position, we'd fire the flares in the sky so we could see where they were coming from.
Mm-hmm.
But we also had coordinates that we would put on a map, and we could direct those to the artillery to fire on certain coordinates, which were just numbers. And the artillery guns were able to fire on those coordinates, and it was very effective.
Mhm. Now, how would you actually call for fire? What kind of radio or communications equipment did you use to reach the guys in their artillery unit?
Well, back in those days, we had very little video. There was none like that. So we had wire connection.
Mhm.
As we'd come up the mountain to where the observation post was, we'd pull wire, just insulated wire, out of a little donut pack we had. So you'd pull that directly up to your observation post, and you could talk to them on the hand-powered telephone. Or if it's, and it did happen a number of times, we'd get a lot of incoming artillery or mortar fire, which would knock out the wire system. So we had a radio, a backup radio that we could talk to the, what we call the fire direction center. They're the ones that plotted it on a map and would give the information to the howitzers to adjust their guns to fire in the right place.
I see. Now, can you tell us a little bit about the howitzers you had, the 105 and the 155, and where were they placed? I guess I should ask, how far were these guns relative to where you were calling from?
Well, we had 6 howitzers, 105 howitzers in C battery, and each battery in a battalion has 6. So when you talk about battalion fire, you have 18 105s that are ready to fire and help you out when you need it. And they were generally located about 1,000 yards behind the front line.
I see. And you also had some 155s,
Yes,
155
well,
howitzers.
155s were farther behind them. They were more at the division level. We had 155 howitzers and 8-inch guns that were back at the division level observation post. We had a battalion as well as a company observation post, and in the battalion OP, they would help provide 155 and 8-inch gun. And we also had ability to call back to them to get air support, which we did a lot of times. It was pretty devastating to have a plane come over and drop napalm on the enemy, and you could see really bad things happening, but we could call in the airstrikes. We could see the napalm bombs being dropped if we needed that, or we could call in the guns from offshore. I had the ability to talk to the battalion OP or at the division level if we needed to get big gun support from the ships.
Mm-hmm. Now, how would you decide if you needed fire support from artillery or air support or from a Navy ship? How would you make that decision as to what was needed?
Well, it would depend mainly on how large the target was and how far it was.
I see.
105s may not be able to reach what you saw through your binoculars. And if we had a mass assault, sometimes we used primarily the air support first. But if you need more to kind of help reach out a little farther, we could call in the 155s or even offshore.
That's really impressive. I think I had told you I interviewed another veteran a couple years ago. He was with the Naval Air Gun Liaison Company. They call them Anglico in the Navy. And he told me the same thing, that he would call in fire from artillery, close air support, and also Navy gunfire, naval gunfire. So that's really interesting that as an Army artillery forward observer officer that you have the same ability to do that. Now, I want to go to a story that I had read of what happened on this dangerous mission that you had on August 8 of 1952. There was an assault that was planned on the enemy's ammunition dumps. And I'm going to let you tell us what happened during that assault and kind of the end result of that, which included a lot of casualties as well.
Yes. Well, during that time when the peace talks were going on, what was happening, basically, we were in the same place, in the same trenches. And occasionally we were facing the Chinese, and occasionally the Chinese would assault our position. So in about the middle of August 1952, some of our higher level executives, officers decided we needed to make a raid out into enemy territory. And most of the time when you were in a stalemated position like that, we'd do patrols every night. They'd have a small squad, 12 or 15 men would go out almost every night to find out where the enemy was. And then they'd come back. As a part observer, I would not go on those small patrols like that unless they had something special they needed. But on this particular occasion, they wanted a company size, which we had about 200 at that time, to make this assault out into enemy territory. And there was a valley just across from where we were stationed in the line. They said, now this I company is going to walk down this valley at night and assault this small hill where they thought an ammunition dump was held, and we're going to try to capture some prisoners too at that time. So our company was pulled out of the line, and we spent a week practicing on how we were going to get down there and what we were going to do. The problem was we had to cross the Engine River before we could get across into enemy territory. And that was going to be done by having the engineers bring some boats down to our front of our position, and get across the river that way. And each boat, you could take about 20 at a time. And all this was going to be done after sundown. So we were faced with trying to get across the river on the other side in enemy territory by individual boats. And part of the problem we ran into that we didn't know about was there was a sandbar right in the middle of the river. And the river was a little bit low, so we ran into the sandbar. Everybody had to get out of the boat to push the boat across the sandbar. So it delayed us about 3 hours just getting across the river. So as we went down the valley, after we finally got across, we made it to this small hill where we thought the ammunition dump was, and we hadn't had any firing or any bother at all on either side of us till we got down there. We had 2 platoons. They were going to assault this hill, and we had been told that it was very lightly guarded, wouldn't be any problem, probably very little fire on us. But as these 2 platoons started up the hill, the whole top of the hill lighted up. And you could tell that it was not lightly guarded, but very heavily guarded with machine guns and a lot of people there. And the 2 assaults, and I remember both of the platoon leaders, knew them very well, and they got beat up pretty badly in both those assaults and had a lot of wounded. And they finally called back to the company commander that I was with and he said, I think we're wasting manpower. We don't need to do this anymore. And the company commander said, well, try one more time. So they made another assault, and it was about the same. And finally, the company commander said, okay, we're going to try to get out of here. So they came back down, and we started trying to go back down the valley that we had come from. And all of a sudden, we had fire coming from both sides of us in the valley. They were following us all the way down, and we had more killed. In fact, as I was going down off the hill, and we'd called in artillery fire on the hill, so we were getting some protection as we were trying to leave, I stumbled over a dead body and reached down to pick up what was there, and it turns out that it was a Chinese soldier that was there. But we went on down trying to get back to the river with firing coming from both sides. And as we approached the daylight, we were very fortunate that a heavy fog came in over the valley where we were, which gave us tremendous protection from what they could see up in the hills on both sides. So I feel very fortunate that God helped us get out of that valley. And I truly believe that was divine intervention that helped us get our company of about 200 back down the valley to cross the river. So we had to do the same thing getting back across the river. So we were very exposed and slowed down because of the sandbar, but we finally finally got up on the other side, which was about noon of the day that we should have been out before the sun even came up.
Right.
We felt very good and fortunate to get out as lightly as we did with the killed and wounded.
Mm-hmm. So during this assault across the Imjin River, you had 14 men who were killed. Is that correct, Mr. Kinard?
Yeah.
That's quite a lot. And out of how many men that started out on this assault mission?
We had about 200.
I see. So this was a really risky and dangerous mission happening in the dark of night when you couldn't see. And then you had this additional obstacle of the sandbar to get over across into the river when you couldn't see anything in pitch dark. I cannot imagine how difficult this must have been. And that's why you had such a delay getting there and then also coming back.
Yes.
And as you said, that fog cover gave you that protection you needed when daylight came.
That's correct. Well, and there's a write-up. There's a website called Engine Bunker Buddies. And there's a write-up in that website, if you can find it on. The date was actually August the 16th, I think, that we did that. Did a lot of rehearsal, a lot of getting ready to go do that. And the date that we actually made that trip through the valley was, I think, August 16th, 1952. And there's a write-up about it in this website of Engine Bunker Buddies.
Imjin Bunker Buddies. I'm going to have to
Yeah.
look that up, Mr. Kinard. Thank you for that resource. And is that website specifically about Korean War, or does it have any other activities that happened beyond the war?
No, this website is about the 3rd Division on the Imjin River.
I see.
So it's written, a lot of the guys who were there on the Imjin River have submitted stories and tales about being on the Imjin River.
That's great. I'm glad you told me about that. I will definitely look it up. And it's interesting when you read different people's accounts, they had different perspectives that maybe, you know, one soldier didn't have, and you can kind of put the pieces together and see what happened when you see an accumulation of people's stories like that.
Well, you know, when you were in a place like that on the Imjin River and the enemy is on the other side of that river, you do a lot of exchange of artillery fire and mortar fire. So everybody that was with that, well, the I Company and K Company, the 3rd Battalion of the 3rd Infantry Division in that line received kind of the same situation with a lot of artillery fire and mortar fire coming in as well as going out.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any idea how many shells on the average? I know it's probably difficult to put a number, but per day, how many shells would be fired from artillery to the enemy?
Well, it really depended on what was happening. Sometimes you didn't fire any if there were no sightings out there for you to place. You know, all the time you're doing that, you're using up part of your ammunition supply. So you have to be very careful.
Yes.
And at one point, I've read in some of the books that they were limited on how much they could fire. Now, that sounds ridiculous. You get into a war and you can't shoot very much, but you know, it wouldn't take long to shoot up to 200 or 300 rounds, but if you needed it, you did. So you fired what you had to for that particular time.
Right.
And we had a lot of situations when first assault that we had, the Chinese were able to get up the hill, and we had barbed wire that was rolled across in front of the trench. And we had Chinese that actually got into the wire, and they were had a hand-to-hand combat. Now, I was in the bunker with the company commander trying to call in artillery fire, but that's how close they got at times. Was almost in the trench with us.
Hmm. Now, one thing we skipped over that we need to go back to, Mr. Kinard, is that when you first arrived in Korea, you were attached to the ROK Division. I know we talked about this raid you made with the 3rd Division, but let's go back to some of the pictures of you with the ROK soldiers, South Korean Army soldiers, and I think it also an interpreter. So I'm going to share with everyone here some pictures of you in Korea. So that's the picture of you in Korea in 52. And this is a group picture with a couple of the ROK soldiers with you. Can you tell me who's in this picture and anything you'd like to share about that?
Yes. Well, I did spend about 2 months with the 1st ROK Division when I first got over there, because the 3rd Division was in reserve, except for the artillery. So the ROKs didn't have artillery support like we did. So the American artillery battalion would support the ROKs, even though the rest of the 3rd Division was in reserve. We would be there to help the ROK Division that was in the line to replace them. And that was a picture of me with the ROK officers of that company that I was with. And the 2 that are on my right were, one was company commander, Captain Tao, the other was Sergeant Lee, and it's kind of interest, he was a Japanese soldier that was there with us, which was a little strange. You didn't see too many Japanese there. And on my left was an interpreter. Of course, the Koreans could not speak any English, and I certainly couldn't speak any Korean. So Sun Jae Kwan was our interpreter to help us communicate with each other. And he worked very well. I was very proud of him and his help in trying to get both from me to them and them to me. Because we had to have that information to be able to do an effective job.
Well, I don't know how good his English was, but I imagine there was still quite a cultural gap. Do you remember anything funny or weird that happened because of the cultural gap in communicating with these Korean soldiers?
Well, yeah, but even though we had a good interpreter, sometimes we couldn't figure out what they had to say. But on the worst assault we had one night, things got really tight. And he got where they told me when I went up there to make sure you know where that company commander is. And some of the part observers had been abandoned. I mean, some of the ROKs would drop back down off of the top of the line. So I tried to stay very close to him all the time and make sure I knew what he was doing. And Son would help me out with that. So he was giving me good advice all along about whether we needed to stay or whether we needed to retreat a little bit. And sometimes that happened, that you just needed to stay very close to them and do what you could to make sure communication was good and clear and you knew exactly what they were doing.
Mhm.
So with son, I never did have any problem with that.
That's
I
good.
always pretty much knew where he was, and he helped us. See, we had a team that we'd take up there. Usually we'd have a team of four. One was the interpreter and had a radio operator and a driver. We had a Jeep that had all of our equipment on it. So we were well supplied with what we did. Of course, the other thing is we had to eat sea rations. We would take a box of sea rations with us, and the sea rations usually had 3 cans in it. One can was a what they call the entree, I guess. It was beans and weenies or sausage, and another can had crackers in it. Another can had dessert, supposedly. And in that dessert can, you usually have a little orange slice or something that was a little different. And if you looked at the sea ration boxes, most of those had been packed in 1946.
Mhm.
We were there in 1952. That was 6 years later, and some of those orange slices were just like a hockey puck.
I heard
Yeah.
about our Korean War veterans eating 10-year-old sea rations. So I totally understand. I've been hearing that a lot from veterans, that they got old sea rations that weren't
Yeah.
necessarily good anymore.
Well, sometimes if we were there long enough, the battery would try to send up a hot meal, but so many times they couldn't make it up because of all the stuff that was going on. So most of the time we were eating the sea ration.
And did you get to try any Korean food while you were attached to the Korean soldiers?
No.
Probably wasn't going to be healthy for you if you tried Korean food
Yeah.
anyway. It wasn't
Yeah.
sanitary. I know that.
No, well, I really didn't know at that time what was good. I do now, but most of the time we depended on our own sea ration.
Uh-huh.
In fact, they'd want some of what we had.
Uh-huh. Now, did you have any time to write home to your wife or receive letters from your wife about how she was doing back home? What kind of correspondence did you have while you were in Korea with your wife?
Well, I'd try to write a letter home every night if I could, if things
Mhm.
weren't. And they'd come pick the letters up and bring the mail to us. But moving around the way we did from the time I left home till it was about, I'd say at least a month or 6 weeks before I ever got mail from home. But they were able to pick ours up. If I wrote a letter, it pretty much got picked up. It'd take about a week or maybe a little more to get from where I was to home. But I didn't get mail very often unless we were at a place where we were going to stay there for a little while. Then they could bring the mail to us. But otherwise, it was very intermittent.
Mhm.
The mail service tried to do what they could, but they never could catch up with us very easily.
Sure. So while you were in Korea, your wife really didn't know where you were or how you were doing, I imagine, because like you said, letters were difficult. Well, maybe the letters from Korea coming to US was easier, but it was probably harder for you to receive any letters back from her, I imagine.
Yeah, well, my wife and my mother both got a Korea map, and the best they could find Weijeonbu, but once we got back in the line from Weijeonbu, it was hard to, I couldn't even tell them where I was. Really, we were just up in the mountains, and so they, as you say, they literally didn't know where I was, except they could find the Imjin River, and I was somewhere along there.
Mm-hmm.
But we were able to get good letter exchange after I'd been there for a while.
Mhm. Have you kept some of the letters you wrote home? Do you still have
I
some of those
have,
letters?
I have them all, yes.
Oh, wow. That's great. That's
And I'm
wonderful.
using that to try to write a little story about my time in Korea. So
Uh-huh.
I'm still working on that.
Oh, that's great. I would love to see what you write and share with us. I know a veteran who exchanged almost 200 letters with his wife while he was in Korea, and he numbered each one that he sent. So she
Yeah,
can kind of see the sequence because sometimes they would be delivered at different times. And they still have all the letters they exchanged, a couple hundred letters.
that's good. You
And
know,
that is a personal history as well, isn't it?
that is right. That's
Yes.
I have maybe half that many. There were some days that I just didn't get to write a letter.
Right. You
Uh,
were a little bit busy.
too much was going on.
Yes.
I'd usually do it by candlelight anyway.
Right. Wow. That's really historic to have something like that. I'm so glad you have all your letters. That's something that your family, I'm sure, will treasure for generations of your time in Korea. The next question I'm going to ask you, Mr. Kinard, I think relates to what you told me of what you saw in Seoul. You told me it's a memory that stays with you from the Korean War. Can you tell me what you remember seeing in Seoul, this memory that stays with you?
Yes, the thing that stuck in my mind, we were at the 3rd Division Replacement Center, I guess, 3 days before we got our actual unit assignment, and a captain and I made a Jeep trip into Seoul. I mean, we didn't go very far, but we saw nothing but destroyed buildings. There were a few walls left. Most of it was rubble, a lot of rubble, and uh, you could look across the sky, and that's all you could see from where we were, was just destruction. And one evening when we went there, it was kind of late in the day, and we went into one of the buildings or were walking down the street, and all of a sudden we had a big swarm of kids, young Koreans that came up to us, and I'm sure they tried to approach every American soldier they could, wanting food or something. So we gave them what we had. I don't remember whether we had, I think I had a candy bar or two that we handed to them and whatever else, but they looked to me like they were about 7, 8, 9 years old mostly, and they were living in that rubble. And it just really touched my heart to know that they didn't have anywhere to go, or at that time there was no shelling or anything going on in Seoul. They were just trying to survive among the rubble of the buildings that were there. And I've thought about that many times and wondered how they really survived when there was not much to eat or much for them to be able to get during that time.
Mhm.
That's a very vivid memory for me.
So it's just a group of kids that were begging for food in the streets.
Yeah,
Imagine they were orphans as well. They had lost
yeah,
their parents in the war.
I'm sure they were. I'm
Yes.
sure they were orphans.
Mhm. I hear that a lot from veterans that, despite all the dangers you faced every day, not knowing whether you would be killed, that the thing that stays with our veterans the most is the suffering of the Korean people, the children, and the women. And I just find that to be so humbling as a Korean that you thought of us, even though you yourself were also in danger of losing your life. And that's
Well,
so very kind and compassionate, I think, of Americans who did so much during the war. I posted a lot of stories about orphanages that American soldiers have helped, and hospitals and schools that they built during the war. 40th Infantry built a high school. They donate their own money in Gapyeong area. So there's so many amazing humanitarian things that Americans have done, even during the war, that I have always been so grateful for. And stories like yours really make me feel so grateful that even though you yourself were suffering, you were looking on the suffering of the Korean people. And
Well,
that
I've
has stayed.
always wished we had more, that we've been uh, able to give them more, but at that time we were just barely getting by ourselves,
Mhm,
really trying to get what we had, go where we needed to go, and
mhm,
that was kind of it.
mhm,
But we had a lot of Katusas, those that were working with the Army too. We built an observation post. One day I moved from where I was to another place, and they said, you need to put an observation post up there. So we had a group of Katusas there that were digging the place out of the wall to try to put the bunker and get the sandbags and logs up there. And we fed them very well, at least what we had. And they probably got uh, some of the best food they had. And I felt like the Katusas, they were right in the line with us. I mean, they were people that I appreciated. We were getting incoming rounds, and they were there just like the rest of us.
mhm.
I do have a big appreciation for the Katusas that work with the Army there.
Well, I want to share with you a short story about sea rations and my mom. My mom was about 9 years old during the war, and she said one day uh, some people lined up, and she found out they were lining up to get American sea rations. They were giving it out to civilians, and so she was in line and she got her box, and she said, "Wow, everything looks so foreign, things she had never seen before." But the thing
Yeah,
she remembers most is the taste of tang, the powder orange tang. She
yeah,
said she
yeah,
has never forgotten the taste of that, how good that tasted. She had never had anything like that before. And so I know that from time to time, they passed out sea rations. And, my mom was not an orphan. She was just a kid, with her
yeah,
family. And they were giving out food and rations to civilians just because it was wartime and hard to find food anywhere, whether you were orphan or not. And so she remembers opening these really foreign objects in the sea ration, but really, really liking that tang powder thing that she had never tasted
yeah.
before.
Well,
And
that's very
so,
good. I hope she found some that were good to eat.
yes, I think she enjoyed everything because it was so different.
Yeah,
But yeah, that's a fond memory she has, and how giving the Americans were. Even during the war, there were so many humanitarian things that the American military did. Now, I want to ask you about when you returned home from Korea. So, when did you leave Korea, and how did you get back home?
well, I left Korea by boat. We came back on the General A.W. Brewster from out of Incheon. We left from Incheon and went to Japan just on the way, but we didn't really stop. I think we stopped overnight, maybe to pick up some more troops, but took about almost 2 weeks to get home back to San Francisco, Treasure Island. And Betty met me out there. And of course, I had to go through all the procedure of getting back. They wanted to do a physical and check us out and make sure we weren't bringing anything back into the States. So it took me, she met me when I got off the boat, and we had just had a chance to kind of exchange hellos and hug a lot. And then we had to get back on a bus and go to the processing center. And I still admire her for being brave enough to drive through the San Francisco and all that traffic there that she wasn't used to, but she followed the bus out to Camp Stoneman where we were deprocessed, and we finally got together there. But another couple had gone with her in the car out to San Francisco, and they left, and she was left to get around the best she could. But we had a good reunion, there in San Francisco after we got down off the boat and I got deprocessed. The next thing I had to do, that was, I guess, right at the end of September. And my discharge date was supposed to be October 13th. So I had, I guess, a week, maybe a little bit more at home before I had to go to Fort Hood and get my discharge. And there they tried to give me the spiel that if you'll stay, we'll make you a captain. You can sign up for another 3 years. And I didn't want to go back to Korea. So I thought, well, I'll just go back to my job, which I had in the power plant. And that's what I did.
Mhm.
But I was still in the reserves from 52 to 1960.
Oh, wow. That's a long time.
Yeah, part of the time active, part of the time inactive. I
I see.
started to join the National Guard, and they were just kids. They didn't know what war was really like. So I decided I didn't want to try to get mixed up with them.
Mhm. So I'm going to ask you to kind of tell me a little bit about how you felt when you got home. How did you feel being back at home where things were at peace, so normal, so different from where you were in Korea, where there's just nothing but devastation? And then what was the reception of your friends? Did they know what was going on in Korea? Did they seem interested in Korea? What was the response of people you knew when you got back?
Yeah, my family was very interested. I mean, they wanted to know a little bit about what I did, but I didn't really tell them a
Mhm.
whole lot about what I'd gone through. And my friends really didn't know anything about the war. A lot of them weren't even following it. But I do remember one thing. I was looking at the newspaper after I got home, and one day on the front page of the newspaper was a picture of where I'd been. I mean, Kelly Hill and all that area along Imsing River. And they were telling about how bad some of them had gotten beaten up. I mean, the Puerto Ricans at that time were in the 65th Regiment of the 3rd Division, and they had been uh, beaten up and they retreated from Kelly Hill. Kelly had been a really bad area, and I could see all of the same area that I'd been on the front of this paper, and that was very, I guess, heartbreaking to me that they had so much damage and so many lost. You know, when you gain a territory like that, we tried to do everything we could to hang on to it. And the Puerto Ricans had a real hard time because they were Spanish under the American officers. And that was just one of the problems we had with UN countries, was being able to communicate. But you know, we appreciated them very much and what they were doing. And at that time, the Puerto Ricans had brought in some new members of their armed forces, and they were not used to Americans very much. So they had a lot of difficulty, and that was one of the problems they had when they lost Kelly Hill.
Mhm. So after you got back home, you said you went into the military reserves, but you went into the workforce.
Yeah.
So can you tell me what you did? What career did you go into after getting back? You had worked at a power plant before the war, so is
Yeah.
that where you went?
Well, I went to back to the same job I
Uh-huh.
had. I was just an engineer in the power plant doing the many things that you need to do. I was 50, early 53, I guess, when I finally went back to work. And in 55, I was we moved from Monahans to Eastland. And I became a plant manager there in Eastland. And that was until 1960. And then we moved back to Eastland, and I was from Eastland to Colorado City in Central Texas, and I became the plant manager there and was there from 1960 to 1971. Then we moved into Fort Worth, and I became the director of human relations in Fort Worth and worked there until, I guess, 1980, and went to Dallas as director of system operations. And I worked there until I retired in 92.
Oh, you retired
Yeah.
in 1992. Well, Mr.
Yeah.
Kinard, I guess we must have crossed paths in Dallas. I was in Plano, not Plano, Las Colinas, Texas, a little
Oh,
north of
yeah.
Dallas, getting my training as a new employee at IBM
Oh,
in
yeah.
1989. So I guess I would have maybe had an opportunity to bump into you, but I wasn't going anywhere near a power plant.
Yeah.
But so you were about retiring when I was starting to work for IBM, and I had gone to Dallas a few times. So, what would you say was rewarding about your career, working at various positions in that industry?
Well, I've thought many times about that. It's unusual for someone to stay with one company that long, but during that time, that was kind of a common thing to do. But when I moved from uh, West Texas into Fort Worth as director of human relations, I enjoyed that job very much. I had a chance to interface with employees, and I've always liked working with people. Just enjoyed being there and getting to know them. And it was a good job. Then I went to Dallas as the director of system operations, and I also became a chairman of a national committee that I worked with utility companies from all over the nation.
Wow.
And we actually had a chance to help write policies for the utility business. And I was on this committee and chairman for 4 years, and finally retired from that about the time I retired from the company I was working for. But I loved doing that too, because we do a lot of traveling. I had a chance to go to Canada because Canada and the US shared some transmission facilities. And we'd had a chance to get acquainted with the east and west coast of Canada and all the northern and eastern part of the US. And it was a good job. So I was glad to be able to do what I did in the last years. And then after that, after I retired, 2 or 3 companies asked if I would work as a consultant with them. So I did. And I worked until actually about 2010, doing some consulting work with some of these companies that I had known about to begin with, and I actually felt very fulfilled with what I was doing. And but after that, then I got so involved with the KWBA that was really taking all of my time and my attention, and I was glad to find a place. But Susan, the thing that I really think about is I worked all of my life at a corporate job and never thought much about what we did in Korea, because people just didn't seem interested or didn't want to know about it until, I guess, 1995, when they built the memorial in Washington. Then that got to be a pretty big deal for Korean veterans, for me in particular. And I found out about KWVA, signed up, and then made my first trip back to Korea in 97, which
Right.
was
So
really a
I'm
good
gonna
trip.
right. So I'm gonna ask you if I can, Mr. Kinar. Sorry to interrupt. What interested you? I mean, you had served in Korea. You came home to raise a family and work in the corporate world. What made you interested in Korean War veterans after retiring? What was the motivator, or I guess something that
Well,
caused you to think about Korean War veterans?
I finally woke up to the fact that we had actually done something really good in Korea, because I really hadn't followed the Korean situation very much until, I guess, early 90s, and thought, well, by the way, that wasn't a wasted trip over there. It ended up that we had really done some good in saving a country and saving its people, and they are so grateful that I need to help make sure our other veterans understand and know what we did. So from that point on, in 2004, I was appointed the National Tell-America Chairman by President Lou Deckard. And I really took that to heart. I mean, what I wanted to do was to do everything I could to get chapters involved with the schools and the civic clubs and others to tell about Korea and what we did. So from that point on, I was devoted until I really got into the national chain to be president. I spent a lot of time. Every day was to get in touch with chapters and people that I knew were Korean veterans to make sure they understood the same thing I found out, that we did good in Korea, and you need to know about it, and we need to get the word out to these kids in the schools and tell them about the Korean War. So we were able to do a lot of that. We had 257 chapters at the time I was working with them, and more than half of those had Tell America programs that were going into the schools and giving the word to civic clubs and others about what the Korean War was all about.
Well, Mr. Kinard, when I first started meeting Korean War veterans back in 2012, one of the Korean War veterans here was involved with Tell America program. And we went into Greenway High School, and they took a big map of the Korean War. I think you know which one. It has kind of like some illustrations on there of all the countries.
That a lot of those maps. Yeah.
Yes. And please go ahead.
Well, we were able, through the government, printed up a lot of these maps. We didn't have money to do that, but at the 50th anniversary, they had a good celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Korean War and printed up a lot of those maps. And I was able to get my hands on some of those, so I sent them out to a lot of the chapters. And that was my job, just to make sure they got some of the publications and the things we had for them to use in the school.
Yes, and as you know, children or students like visuals. They have to be able to picture a place and what the war involved. And so that map was great. I saw that for the first time. I think I have it in my office as well. And I didn't know you were behind all of that, when I had gone to Greenway High School with the veterans.
Sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay, Mr. Kinard. Is it an urgent call? Are you okay?
No, I'm okay.
Okay. So we were talking about Tell America program, where veterans would go in, share their stories, and talk about the Korean War and what good America did by saving South Korea. I think that is such a vital and important program. And I know that that must have been difficult to get into the schools. Was it difficult to get it into the schools? Were the schools open to having veterans come in and talk about the Korean War?
Well, it was not to begin with. What we did in our own chapter, and a lot of others did too, we'd go visit the superintendent of schools and tell them what we were wanting to do, and how good we thought the U.S. had done, and UN really, not just the U.S. So we got into a lot of schools at that time that welcomed us to come in and talk to their students. But as things have gone down the road and they've changed so much the requirement that they need to teach in the schools, you know, these certain subjects in order for them to be able to pass the test, the annual test for the kids, they cut out most of what we were doing. So now about the only way we can get in is if we go through the ROTC programs in the school. Very little time will they, unless you know someone in the school that really wants you to come in and take the time, because we'd take usually an hour per class. So we'd do it about 7 or 8 hours a day to begin with, but then they found out they were using the principal in a lot of cases were finding out we just don't have the time for you now. So that's what is there. You know, that's so ridiculous to think that's a waste of time, but I keep telling them, you know, we're living history. We need to tell you about what we did, and people just don't know what good the United States and the UN countries did in Korea. So a lot of times they just say, well, we're sorry, we know that's good, but we just don't have time.
Well, that's why I think it's even more important that we do this kind of an interview today, Mr. Kinard, because, you know, when a veteran could tell his war experiences and what he believes good came out of that war, and, you know, what our veterans did to save South Korea, that's a message that can be put out there on an interview like this, and somebody will find it on YouTube or Facebook. And that's what I hope, that we can reach people who are looking for information about Korean War veterans, and they will hear your story as well as the veterans, other veterans I will interview. So I hope that even though we can't get into a classroom per se, that we can reach a lot of people who may have a curiosity about the Korean War. So I really appreciate you sharing your stories today. And I certainly appreciate what you have done in those years that you served as the national president of KWVA, being so actively involved in trying to further the legacy and make known the legacy of our veterans to our younger students. I'm going to ask you now about your time as national president of KWVA. You served from 2013 until 2016. Are there some highlights you would like to share about what happened with the Korean War Veterans Association while you were serving? Can you give me an idea of how many chapters there were across the US when you were president, and how many Korean War veterans there were at that time? That was some 8 years ago.
Yeah, we had 257 chapters. And I guess in the organization at that time, we had around 15,000 members. And sad to say, you know, we've gone down very fast because a lot of them are getting to the point where they're dying and can't do things and don't want to do things really because they're getting too old. But early on, we had a very active group of chapters, and we had good meetings. We'd have annual meetings and have a lot of people that would come and have a chance to exchange ideas and see each other, some that you served with, which was to me always a very good thing to do for the individual chapters. And Susan, one of the main things I want to make sure people understand is in the schools with the Tell America program, we started off by saying freedom is not free. And a lot of the kids that we found in the schools didn't really know what the meaning of that was. Some of them who had relatives that were in the war or relatives that had been in the military understood what sacrifice means. But they don't really know unless you look them in the eye and say the freedom you have today was paid for by someone. Some paid the ultimate sacrifice. Some served because it was their duty and that's what they were doing for their country. But you need to realize that the freedom you have today was paid for by someone in the military. And a lot of the kids would perk up and find a meaning in that, but some of them still didn't understand what it really meant. But I think somehow if we can make sure all of them who see this know that someone paid the price for your freedom, it'll be worth our effort.
That is such an important and profound statement, Mr. Kinard. And it's something that I realize every morning when I get up in this free country, having been born to a free South Korea. I was born in 1966, Mr. Kinard, 13 years after the armistice. And the fact that South Korea was a free nation and that I could be born to a free nation was because of you and everyone who served and who gave their lives for us. South Korea could have been totally in the grips of North Korea if America had not come to save South Korea. All of Korea today could be communist, and I could be a prisoner under that tyranny, and my life could have been so different. So you have changed the destiny of my life, Mr. Kinard, as all of our Korean War veterans who fought. I also have behind me pictures of two Korean War MIAs. These are families that I know. One is Joseph Matsunaga, the other one is Daniel Hunt. And those two heroes were missing. Now, Daniel Hunt was recovered in 2016. He's buried here in Phoenix, but Joseph Matsunaga is still missing in North Korea. He's a Japanese American who had fought in World War II, had gone to Korea, and he's still missing after the Battle of Unsan in the winter of 1950. So these heroes and my veterans there, I have veterans from Arizona, they're reminders to me every day of who gave me my life. And everywhere I go, whether it's veterans or students, I try to explain that I am here and my life is possible only because of veterans. And that is exactly the same message that you just shared, that freedom is not free, that it has to be fought for and sacrificed for. And you and all these heroes did just that. You sacrificed so much to give us our freedoms. And,
thank you, Susan. I think that's so important, but all of the Koreans have been so grateful. You know, it makes us proud to know that they represent and know what we did, and they really do appreciate it. But you asked the question about something that I remember. I was very fortunate in 2013 as president to represent the Korean veterans, the United States Korean veterans at the General Assembly of all the UN presidents. That was held in June of 2013, and I went as the US representative and had the chance to stay there a week and mingle and mix with presidents from all the UN countries. I was so blessed and felt so good about our being able to get together and make sure all of the nations did what they could. And I found all the UN country presidents there to feel the same way I did about we did something really good and we're glad we did it.
yes, absolutely. What a magnificent gathering that must have been from the 21 United Nations countries and all the Korean War veteran leadership gathered together. That must have been quite amazing, like a reunion of all the heroes from the war.
Oh, it was just an absolute glorious trip to have the chance to do that. And of course, all that time, the Koreans were welcoming us, welcoming all the UN representatives, and we were treated like kings, and it was such a wonderful trip, and it's a highlight of my life to have had a chance to do that.
Yes, well, I always feel that our Korea's greatest heroes and royalty are our Korean War veterans from other countries, especially America. And I am so glad that you felt so honored and appreciated during your trip. Now I'm going to share a couple of pictures of you here, and I'm going to have you tell me a little bit about your other trips. I know you had made several trips to Korea, and I'm going to share a picture of you here from your trip in 2013. And let's see here. Okay. Now, in this picture, you're at the National Cemetery in Seoul, signing the book there for special guests, VIP, that visit the cemetery. This was in 2016, wasn't it, Mr. Kinard?
Yes, it was.
And you were still president of the National KWVA, and you had been invited by Satan Presbyterian Church. I see Admiral Kim behind you there with a lot of
Yes.
TV crew. Can you tell me a real special memory or a highlight from this trip?
Susan, I think working with the Satan Church is another highlight of my life, but the one that I think sticks in my mind, one day we went as a group that the Satan had invited, we rode a bus to the Satan Church going to one of their services, and they had a long row of kids and some older people, but they were all there waving the flag and saying thank you as we walked into the building. And I think for all of the Korean veterans that were there for that visit, that was one of the highlights, is to see all those kids and know that they appreciated what we did and the sacrifices that were made. But, you know, all of those things that they did for us is trying to entertain us and say thank you to us, all of that, those were very meaningful to us, to know that people like that in Korea still really appreciate all of what we did.
Yes, and every one of those little kids are your legacy.
They are, that's right.
Yes, the fact that they live in freedom, that's your legacy. Millions of Koreans that live all over the world in freedom is the legacy of our Korean War veterans, not just in Korea, because Koreans have gone everywhere around the world. So wherever they live free, all those Koreans are the proud legacy of our Korean War veterans like you, Mr. Kinard. And we can never thank you enough for the life and freedoms you've given to us. Now I'm going to go next into, actually, before we go into the next set of questions, I want to ask you about KWVA, if I may go back a little bit. I know that the current situation of our KWVA chapters is that as our veterans are getting older, there's less and less members, less and less officers to continue to lead. What do you think is the future of KWVA? What do you think is the key to keeping KWVA going into the future?
Well, when I was president, I felt at that time, seeing that we were losing a lot of the war veterans. Anytime you get to the mid 80s to the early 90s, you know that they're going to not be around very long. And I look back at what I think our legacy will be, and I think that legacy needs to be carried by the defense veterans, those who served after the war was over and provided the protection that I think was needed for South Korea. I firmly believe if we hadn't had the troops there to provide the protection, that North would have invaded again. I mean, they still threaten that. It's still a very big concern for all of us about what they will do. And they still have the leadership that is a little bit unknown, and Kim Jong-un is not given any space as far as trying to make reunification happen. I'd very much like to see that happen. But basically, I want the Korean defense veterans to take over our KWVA and recognize that we need to keep that going to make the legacy continue on and perpetuate all of the good things that we've done and do the very best they can to make sure our country understands what the Korean War was all about. So I'm very much in favor of our chapters bringing in the defense veterans and let them take over what we've done. I think for me, you know, people like me, I'm 92 years old and I'm going to be around a little while longer. But in doing that, I'm hoping we'll be able to attract more who served in Korea after the war was over.
Yes, and as you know, Mr. Kinard, there's over 3 million American men and women who have served in Korea after the armistice to the present day. There's 3 million service members and veterans out there. So I know that's a big number, and I've met some, and all of them, I tell you, Mr. Kinard, all the defense veterans have such a great respect and regard for our Korean War veterans, because they know that when they served in Korea, that Korean War had happened. And they often think about what happened at places that they're serving in during the war. So I know they have a great interest and a great admiration for our Korean War veterans and what they achieved during the war to save South Korea. And I know they absolutely follow in the footsteps of veterans like you who have defended Korea. So I know that would be so great if our defense veterans could carry the legacy on for our Korean War veterans. I'm sorry to have skipped around here, but I had forgotten that question, so I wanted to make sure to ask you that. But let's go back to your Korea visit. I know you had gone 5 times to Korea, is that correct?
Yes.
After the war, you had gone back for 5 times, 5 different visits to Korea.
Right.
And your very first time back since the war in 1997 was your first trip. I imagine that was the most shocking trip for you in terms of what you saw of the transformation of Korea. Can you tell me what your feelings were and what you thought when you first stepped foot in Korea in 97? This would have been, let's see, you were there 52, so 45 years later, you were returning to Korea.
Well, it was unbelievable to me. I took my oldest son, and it was the highlight of his life to be able to make that trip. And we had a really good time together. But when we went to the DMZ, had an opportunity to look around and then travel around a little in Seoul. I have no idea where I was when I went there in 52, but to see all the buildings and mainly the cars, automobiles, people seem to be prosperous and living a good life. And it is another one of those things that make me feel so good to see the country be able to overcome all they did in that period of time. So I just couldn't believe it to begin with. It was one of those things that you almost can't believe your eyes. In fact, when I went up in the hotel and looked out across Seoul and saw all of the buildings that were there that appeared to be relatively new, but it was such a hustling, bustling economy, it made me extremely proud. And that's one of the things that I've told a lot of the veterans. If you haven't been, you need to go back and see what they've done with all of what we've given them. And I think there are a lot of sacrifices made to get what you've gotten, but you did a big part of making it restored the economy and restore the prestige, respect in the world. So I give the Koreans a lot of credit for all of that we helped them be able to do it.
Yes, I know that even after the war, Mr. Kinard, a lot of post-war economic aid was given to Korea by America. But I do know that that generation of people who survived the Korean War, my parents' generation and my grandparents' generation, I know they worked very hard to rise from the ashes of war and to push the country forward and advance the country. So I know that it is by God's grace and because of the sacrifice of our veterans that we were given that opportunity to work hard to get to where we are. So I am so grateful to America for so many things. And if not for America, South Korea would not exist today. I always say that. Without America, South Korea would not exist. And I know other countries served as well, but America has been the longest standing ally and help and defender of South Korea. So I am so grateful to be an American citizen now. And I am so proud and I love America. And I'm so grateful to have had this conversation with you. Now, as we close, Mr. Kinard, I'm going to ask you, I know you had been the national chairman of Tell-America. Now, obviously, that program may be more difficult to get into schools today. So if there are students watching today, this video, what would you like them to know about the Korean War?
Well, I'd like them to know that, again, that freedom is not free and war is hell. I mean, there's no way that anybody wants to go and be in a war, but we did. The United States went in at President Truman's call and did something that many other nations joined us. Today, you probably couldn't get other nations to do what we did. But that was one point in the life of a lot of us that we can be very proud of, and we want you to be proud of it too, because we as a country, along with other nations, went in and saved the country, saved the people, and look what they're doing in the world today. And you mentioned a while ago, you believe God has provided direction for you. I'm so glad that a lot of Koreans are Christian, and I believe in the Christianity, and I think if all of us could understand that there is a God and there is a Christian religion that I think will put us all on the right path. And I'm so grateful that a lot of the Koreans feel the same way. And the other last thing, I guess, is Korea is still, as you said, one of our strongest allies and has been for a long time, and are so grateful to the United States and other countries here 70 years later, still expressing that feeling that you did something good for us, and we're glad you did. Thank you very much.
Well, Mr. Kinard, you are probably the best spokesperson of all of our Korean War veterans in America. And I still thank you for sharing all of your insights, your passions about the legacy of our Korean War veterans. But I want to ask you this one last question. Is there anything I didn't ask you that you want to share or talk about?
Susan, I think you've done a good job, a very thorough job of covering the subject. And I hope I've given all of you a little feel of what it was like to be there, and just a plain ordinary citizen. That's what I am, just a little guy from West Texas that grew up, and that was one of the most, I guess, momentous times in my life, serving in Korea, then again serving as president of the national organization. It was an experience that I'll never forget, and one that I was extremely glad I had the opportunity to serve. We still have a lot of good Korean veterans that are out there, and I hope someday we can reach them and make sure that they know that their service in Korea was appreciated and they did a good job.
Yes, every time I meet a Korean War veteran, I make sure they know the truth, that they did a great job. They saved us, my family, the people of Korea, and gave us our freedoms. There's no greater gift that we could have asked for than our freedoms and our lives. And our Korean War veterans gave us that. Now, Mr. Kinard, I keep forgetting about our slideshow. There's a couple more things I want to show the audience here, and that is your recent visit to the Korean War Veterans Memorial. Oops. Are you there?
I'm still here.
I don't know what happened here. I don't know what I'm doing now. Okay, well, let's see. Okay, I'm going to share the screen. You at the Korean War Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. recently. On May 21st, 2021, there was a groundbreaking ceremony for the Wall of Remembrance. The Wall of Remembrance will list the names of 36,574 American heroes who gave their lives in Korea, along with some 7,000 names of Katusas. And you were part of the ceremony, Mr. Kinard. I believe you gave the invocation. I saw the beautiful prayer you delivered at the ceremony. And here, can you tell me about these gentlemen with you in this picture?
Yes, both of these were there at the groundbreaking. Lou Ewing, the one on my extreme left there, was Secretary of National Secretary at the time I was president, very good friend of mine. And Colonel David Clark is a recent retiree from the military service. Dave has been on the national board, and some of you may remember that in, I think it was 2020, when did he ride on the Rose Parade? That was
Yes, I think he was part of the 60th commemoration. So from 2010 on, he was involved in so many commemorations for the 60th anniversary of the war, Korean War.
That's right. That's
Yes.
right. Dave does a good job. He's still works for the Army and the intelligence, but he's a good member, and he's a defense veteran. He does a good job in helping the Korean War veteran organization continue to go. And I
Yes.
was glad to see him.
Yes, he did a great job with the I don't know if you know, but before the ceremony, there was a pre-show, and he went over the overview of the Korean War history, and he did an excellent job. The next thing I want to show everyone is a picture of Sherry Stewart, our good friend Sherry. Now, why isn't this advancing? Oh, there it is. So this is you with Miss Sherry Stewart. She is very involved with all of you in Texas, Chapter 215. And I know she has been a great advocate and a helper to all of our Korean War veterans there. But a lot of people don't know that she also has an uncle who was killed in action in Korea on the breakout of the Busan perimeter on September 21st. And her father also served in Korea. And
Right.
so her uncle's name, David Daniel Stewart, will be among the 36,574 American heroes' names listed on the wall. Now, I know that she's also working with you now on another project in Texas, in Arlington. Mr. Kinard, can you tell me a little bit about what you and Sherry are working on now in Arlington, Texas?
Yes, we're trying to get a memorial built for the Korean veterans in the Veterans Park in Arlington, Texas. And we've made an agreement with the city of Arlington to do that. There are already 2 memorials, one for Vietnam, one for World War II, and they have given us a site to build another memorial for the Korean War. We are very grateful to the city of Arlington, Texas for helping us do that. We're just now finishing with our fundraising program, hope to get additional funds to help complete the memorial, but I'm sure we will start construction on that later this year. And we're hoping to be ready to dedicate it in about a year, probably next fall.
That's great. I think all these memorials, the Wall of Remembrance in DC, the one you're working on in Arlington, and so many across this country, is such an important marker for future generations to see the legacy of our Korean War veterans. And I am so grateful to you and Sherry for the tremendous amount of work it must be to construct that memorial in Texas. And I'm looking forward to being there when you dedicate it, Mr. Kinard.
Well, Susan, thank you very much for what you're doing. I think it's a wonderful service, especially for Korean veterans and for what the U.S. did in Korea in 1950 to 53. That was a long war and many sacrificed their lives, and what you're doing is going to help to make people remember that that was an important time in the life of the U.S.
Well, I am honored and humbled to follow in your footsteps, Mr. Kinard. You were doing this many decades before me in furthering the legacy of our Korean War veterans. And I absolutely commit my life to making sure that Americans and Koreans will always remember what our Korean War veterans have done. And I am so grateful to have spoken with you today. I really appreciate you taking such a long time and sharing so much of your life. And I hope that many other veterans will share their stories as well. Well, God bless you, Mr. Kinard. I hope to see you soon in Texas or anytime before that. Please stay healthy and well. And I thank you for everything you have done throughout your life for your fellow veterans and in service to our country. I cannot thank you enough.
Susan, thank you for the opportunity. This is my story. This is what I want others to know about. And thank you for helping do that.
Thank you, Mr. Kinard. God bless you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.